The cold tide of the Spanish coast pulled relentlessly at the sand. It was the morning of the 30th of April, 1943, when a fisherman caught sight of a dark shape caught in the surf. He waded into the freezing water, grabbed the man by the shoulders, and hauled him onto the wet grit of the beach. The stranger was still, his skin pale and unresponsive. The fisherman reached out to check for a pulse, but his hand stopped. A heavy leather briefcase was locked to the dead man's wrist. The chain was taut, biting into the swollen skin. He tugged, but the lock held fast. The fisherman looked up and down the empty coastline, his breath hitching in the damp morning air. This was no ordinary accident. The man had been placed here, delivered by the current with a secret he was never meant to lose. The fisherman backed away, leaving the body and its burden in the sand. He did not know it then, but he had just unearthed the first piece of a ghost story that would rewrite the map of the war. Far from the Spanish shore, the war was locked in a rigid, lethal pattern. Hitler kept 19 elite divisions stationed at the Pas de Calais, his eyes fixed on the narrowest crossing point between England and France. He waited for a strike that he was certain would come there. The Allied planners studied the maps and saw the wall of steel. A direct assault on that position meant certain slaughter. They needed a distraction, but a simple feint would not hold the German command's focus. They required a deception so layered, so grounded in human detail, that it would force the German High Command to look away from Normandy. The decision was made in a quiet, smoke-filled office in London. The planners needed a man who did not exist. They needed a phantom to walk into the path of the enemy. They began the search for a body, an empty vessel they could fill with a fabricated life. The objective was clear: convince the German intelligence network that the dead man was their most dangerous source of information. The ghost had to be perfect. In the sterile silence of a London morgue, the agents found what they needed. Glyndwr Michael had died in total obscurity, his life ending in the cold grip of poverty. He was a man without a home, without a legacy, and now without a future. The agents moved with precise, clinical efficiency as they prepared the body. There was no ceremony, only the heavy sound of rubber gloves against skin and the metallic slide of a tray. They stripped away the remnants of his civilian life and began the transformation. The process was chilling in its detachment. To the agents, this was not a man anymore. It was a tool, a canvas upon which they would paint a fiction. They handled his limbs with the same calculated care one might use to pack a delicate instrument for transport. The air in the room was thick with the scent of formaldehyde and the weight of what they were about to do. They were erasing Glyndwr Michael to make room for a ghost. They worked in silence, systematically turning a human casualty into the centerpiece of an international deception. The transformation required more than a label. It demanded a history. The agents began the delicate work of populating a dead man's pockets with the debris of a life never lived. They tucked in a theater ticket stub from a London play, the paper slightly worn at the corners. A dry cleaning receipt followed, dated and stamped to provide a sense of routine. Then came the letter, written by hand on thin paper, complaining about money and the frustrations of a father to his son. Every item was chosen to survive the scrutiny of a skeptical German agent. Jean Leslie stepped into the frame, her expression carefully neutral as she posed for the photograph that would become the cornerstone of the deception. They slid the picture into a leather wallet, placing it next to the other forged remnants. It was a masterpiece of manufacture. They were not merely dressing a corpse. They were constructing a person who felt loved and worried. Every scrap of paper, every ink stain, and every folded note served a single purpose: to anchor the ghost in reality. By the time they finished, the man in the morgue possessed a past that felt more authentic than his own. The trap was set with the mundane details of a human existence. The HMS Seraph slipped away from the coast, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. On the deck, the agents moved with the urgency of a secret that could break at any moment. They lowered the body over the side, the weight of the chained briefcase dragging at the wrist, pulling the figure into the cold embrace of the Spanish tide. The ocean took him, pulling the fabricated identity into the dark, churning surf. Hours later, the silence of the beach broke. A local fisherman waded into the shallows, his hands closing around the man in the water. He hauled the weight onto the sand, his pulse quickening at the sight of the leather bag locked to the arm. The authorities arrived before dawn. They moved with mechanical efficiency, securing the evidence and contacting their German counterparts. The briefcase, still damp with salt, passed from hand to hand. Inside, the forged documents waited, their ink crisp and convincing. The German agents took possession of the bag, their eyes scanning the papers with the hunger of predators. They believed they had found a prize of war. They did not know they were holding a ghost that would decide the fate of Europe. The documents reached Berlin with the speed of a priority dispatch. Hitler sat at his desk, the salt-stained papers spread out before him. He studied the maps, the troop deployments, and the invasion timelines. His finger traced the lines leading toward Greece and the Balkans, the supposed targets of the Allied force. He looked up, his eyes fixed on the reports. The logic held. The evidence was absolute. He became convinced that the build-up in the south was the true threat, while the activity in the north was nothing more than a diversion. He made his choice. He issued the command to lock the 19 elite divisions at Pas de Calais. He would not move them. He would not reinforce the coast. Instead, he kept his most powerful forces waiting for an attack that would never come. The decision rippled through the German High Command, freezing their defensive strategy in place. He was certain he had outmaneuvered the enemy. In reality, he had just signed the death warrant for his own defense. The Allies had their opening. The deception was complete, and the path to the continent was now wide open. He remained motionless, anchored to a phantom threat, while his grip on the coast began to slip away. The 6th of June, 1944. The horizon at Normandy darkened. Thousands of ships emerged from the mist, their engines churning the grey water into white foam. Landing craft hit the surf, metal grinding against sand. As the first wave surged forward, across the channel, the 19 elite divisions at Pas de Calais stood ready. Field officers watched the reports coming in from the coast, their radios crackling with news of the massive assault. They waited for the order to move. They waited for the command to reinforce the line, but the order never came. Hitler remained convinced the true strike was imminent elsewhere, dismissing the chaos at Normandy as a desperate diversion. Minutes stretched into hours. The Allied soldiers pushed inland, securing the beachhead, digging into the earth, and establishing their position. The German commanders watched the opportunity to crush the invasion, vanish, trapped by a strategy built on a lie. They held their positions, watching the sea, while the real war moved past them. Every ship that reached the shore, every soldier who climbed the dunes, owed their survival to the silence of the guns at Calais. The deception worked exactly as planned. The path was open, and the beachhead held. The strategic victory was absolute, yet it rested upon a foundation of quiet tragedy. Glyndwr Michael had never stood for a cause. He had never volunteered for the front lines. He was a man who had died in the silence of poverty, far from the halls of power, only to be reclaimed by a government seeking a ghost. They took the remains of a life already extinguished and wove it into a fiction, turning a man into a weapon of war. He was placed in the soil of a foreign coastline, miles from the home he knew, bearing a name that belonged to a shadow. The authorities manufactured a history for him, filling his pockets with fabricated memories and false attachments to ensure the deception held under the scrutiny of enemy spies. He was a pawn moved across the board of a global conflict, his own existence erased to protect the thousands who survived. He rested in a grave that remained a monument to a lie, a final resting place in a country he never chose to serve. His sacrifice was not a choice, but a circumstance. A man utilized and discarded by the machinery of his own state. For over 50 years, the headstone in the Spanish soil held the wrong name. It marked the spot where a man was buried under a false identity, a final layer of the elaborate deception that had served its purpose and faded into history. The world moved on, the war ended, and the man who had been turned into a weapon remained lost behind the mask of Major William Martin. Then, in 1998, the silence finally broke. A new plaque was mounted upon the stone, stripping away the fiction that had held for decades. It bore the name Glyndwr Michael. The correction did not change the past, but it reclaimed the truth of the man who had been used as a tool in the machinery of war. He remained in the soil of a country he never chose, a place he never visited in life. He stayed a ghost, a man who never volunteered for the conflict that claimed his final purpose. Yet, the ledger was balanced. The man who had saved an entire army by never existing at all was finally recognized for who he was. The deception had succeeded, the war had been won, and at last, the nameless pawn was given back his name.